it's time to start. Good evening, everyone. My name is Mahmoud Mohamedou. I'm the Deputy Director and Academic Dean of the Geneva Center for Security Policy. On behalf of Ambassador Doucet, our director, all of my colleagues here assembled, I'm very happy to welcome you to this new series we're starting tonight, the Geneva Security Debates. One of the pillars of the research here that we conduct, which is the applied policy research, the executive education, but also the purpose is also to have dialogue. And one of the ideas that we have with this new series is to open a space for intelligent, nuanced debate in a very much a spirit of sportsmanship, which I look forward to hearing tonight. And we hope also to open this to the public and having people engage with the issues of the day that we're going to have. This new series will be hosted by my good colleague here, Janine Di Giovanni. Janine is the editor for the Middle East section of the Newsweek magazine, and she's an associate fellow at the GCSP. We're happy to have her with us. Janine is a superb journalist, very well-traveled, has contributed a lot, both in journalism, but also in terms of her own work, winning awards as an author, and many such distinguished features, and we're delighted to have her as the regular host of the series as such. Tonight's event will look at the question recently of Russia and Ukraine, and we will do this with two world accomplished specialists, which I'm very happy to welcome as well, Anita Levin and James Nixie. Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you for joining us as well. So without further ado, I'll pass on the floor to Janine. I just wanted to welcome you all. Do keep in touch with what's happening here, the quiet revolution taking place at the GCSB. We look forward very much to welcoming you. There will be more such debates with Janine, and we'll probably have the next one sometime in December. As such, you will receive an announcement. Not much more for me to say except to say thank you to all of my colleagues who helped put this together, and a special thanks goes to my colleague Stephanie Arqueo Sanchez, if I can see her somewhere in the room. She's right here. Thank you very much, Stephanie. And I wish you all a very pleasant evening, full of insights. And on to you, Jen. Thank you very much, everybody.
Good evening. First, I have to apologize to you. I very recently had eye surgery, so I might put on my sunglasses. It's not trying to be glamorous or not to make eye contact with you. It's just that the glare sometimes is too much for me. So please excuse me if I do that. Welcome tonight to our first GCSP debate. We're very happy that you're here. Put simply, Russia and the Ukraine are at war. A war that threatens global order. How did we get here? Did the West provoke Russia with a triple package of NATO expansion, NATO enlargement, EU expansion, and democracy promotion? Were they in fact responsible for the toppling in 2014 of the Ukrainian leader Yanukovych? Were they trying to turn Ukraine into a Western stronghold against Russia? Or, as the former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott remarked, is Vladimir Putin trying to resuscitate a dying country by practicing old-style Tsarist expansionism? Is he fanning a new Cold War? As Barack Obama commented, has he slipped back into a Cold War mentality, which could easily spread to other regions, as we see today, Syria, and in fact all of the Middle East? Or does he simply want Ukraine as his buffer state, going back historically to protect him from other historical disasters, invasions from Napoleonic France, Nazi Germany, Imperial Germany? Should he just have stood by and allowed the West to install a government in Ukraine? Tonight, we're very lucky to have two extremely well-informed experts who are going to first give you their present arguments, then it's going to be up to you to decide. Did the West provoke Russia? The way we're going to do this is you'll see on your seats you have a yellow card and a green card. And I think I'm going to start out first to get a general vote to see what you feel now. And then we'll do it again after they present their arguments, after I quiz them, after you quiz them, and after they sum up, we'll have a second vote. to see if they have in fact done a good job at persuading you one way or the other. So the green cards are going to be for the motion, and the yellow are against. So could we start out and see how many are voting for the motion? Did the West provoke Russia? And someone else is going to count because I can't see.
So this is yes, they did.
Yeah.
The West did.
This is yes, they did. How many? Anyone give me a rough?
24.
Greens and passion. Okay. Yellow. Against. Oh. Okay. Good.
It's about the same. I think, from my rough count.
Yellow is.
I think it was 24-23, but
So
I'm
now
not
we
exactly-
need to see if we could persuade you one way or the other. Let me first introduce our guests. Tonight we have Professor Anatol Lieven from Georgetown University in Doha. He's also a professor of war studies a professor in the War Studies Department at King's College, London. He's a senior fellow at the New America Foundation in Washington, and his latest book is On Pakistan, A Hard Country. It was published in 2011, but of course he's published many books on the former Soviet Union, and I just want to point out one which was written in 1999, Ukraine and Russia, A Fraternal Rivalry, which I'm sure they can buy on Amazon.
Not in many bookshops, though it should be.
But you can find it if you try. He's also a former colleague of mine from the Times of London. We go way back to the Second Chechen War in my case. He's been working for many years in Afghanistan, Russia, the Ukraine, Southeast Asia, all over the place. And I think you're going to enjoy what he has to say. This is James Nixie, who is the esteemed head of the Russia Eurasia division. He's very
Told her not to say that.
self-deprecating. He didn't want me to say that, at Chatham House in London. He joined in 2000 after working as both a banker and a journalist in Moscow, two areas which I think is going to give him a very unique lens into Russia today. His principal area of expertise is Russia's relations with other former Soviet states. He has degrees in both Russian and international relations, and Italian, I believe, correct? So the way this will go is that I'm going to give each of them first 5 minutes to really condense their arguments and paint a picture to sway you to their side. We'll go from one to the other, and then we will go back to them again for another 5 minutes. Then I'll start with some questions, which will try to trigger the debate, and then I really would like you all to give as much as you can to this debate by engaging in it and engaging with them. And then we'll sum up, and then we'll vote again. So first, let's start with Anatol, who's for the motion. And did the West provoke Russia?
Thank you, Janine, and thank you to Dr. Mohamedou and to the GCSP for inviting me. I'm very glad to be here. I think I should point out at the beginning that the question does not ask me, or any of you, if you sympathize with my position, to defend Russian policies on ethical or legal grounds, or even necessarily in terms of Russian interests. It simply asks what does and what does not constitute provocation, historically speaking, in the world today, in the field of international affairs. That's a good thing, because I would not, in fact, wish to defend many Russian actions over Ukraine in recent years. Any more than in recent years, I have defended the ways in which China has pursued its territorial claims in the South China Sea. India has pursued influence and defended its interests in its region. Or, of course, the United States has defended its hegemony in several different parts of the world, including the Middle East and Central America. Unfortunately, however, tragically, regrettably, this is how major powers defend what they see as their vital interests. Russia is no different. It is in no sense unique in this way. And there is no excuse whatsoever for not recognizing the future of Ukraine as a vital Russian interest, as the Russian elite see it, the Russian state sees it, not just because, to be perfectly honest, a very elementary knowledge of Russian history and culture teaches you that, going back, of course, a very, very long way into the past. But also, of course, because the Russian government has said that to us again and again, formally and explicitly. Not just under Putin, but under Yeltsin before him, Russia's vital interests in Ukraine. Now, in these circumstances, whether you were dealing with America in its sphere, America's sphere extends, of course, to the whole world, in the view of Washington, or India, or China, a wise policy in approaching such questions, well, if you really feel you need to challenge the other side, then you'd better be very well prepared and have full commitment behind your policy, which the European Union most manifestly did not, nor indeed did NATO, and it proved that already by not fighting over Georgia in August 2008. If wise policy, if it's not prepared to do that, it should seek compromise and not attack these vital interests directly. If it does, in any of the cases that I have cited, in any historical case, it can expect a very harsh response, which is what we've got in the case of Ukraine. Now, in Western Europe, we have tended to forget these lessons of history because, of course, for more than 60 years now, we have lived in a peaceful part of the world in which every West European state has been surrounded by friendly, allied states with completely compatible political and economic systems, part of international organizations, and, of course, under the protection of the United States. We haven't needed to remember these lessons, except, of course, when some of us have gone outside Europe, like France, for example, in Africa, if I may say so, when they have remembered them very well. But this, you see, is the whole point. The entire rhetoric of the West towards Russia in the former Soviet Union has been based on the argument and the expectation that Russia should play by European Union rules. Not even by NATO rules, given some of what NATO has got up to and what some of NATO members have got up to, that Russia should play by European Union rules without being or having any prospect whatsoever of being a member of the European Union and NATO, and enjoying all the protections that the European and support that the European Union and NATO have given. Indeed, the entire slogan, which has been repeated endlessly, particularly in Washington, that we in the West are aiming at a Europe whole and free, explicitly excludes Russia from Europe, and has indeed contributed enormously to the perception of Western hostility, and that the West is bitterly opposed to Russia and Russian vital interests. Now, in these circumstances, it is entirely reasonable for Russia to play by the rules not of the European Union, but of the rest of the world, including, as I say, the rules by which Western countries themselves have played outside Europe. Not just in the more distant past, if you look at the empires, but quite recently. France in Africa, Turkey in its sphere, and the United States across much of the globe. Now, I'll come back, perhaps, in the later discussion about the deeper causes of this conflict in terms of Western policy. But just in terms of the immediate cause, the demonstrations which obviously had turned violent, there was a violent response from the state. And by the end of February 2014, a reasonable compromise had been reached, brokered by Germany and France above all, whereby the democratically elected president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, would hold early presidential elections, which, to judge by the opinion polls at the time, would almost certainly, can't speak for absolute certainty, but almost certainly have led to him being defeated and being replaced by most probably a more pro-Western president. What then happened? He was chased from power by an armed opposition led by armed extreme nationalist groups, one of which, Svoboda, had been denounced for its chauvinism and anti-Semitism by the European Parliament itself, which had called on the Ukrainian government and European governments not to cooperate with this party. And, of course, the parties that had supported Yanukovych were either directly banned or intimidated and forced themselves to flee from Kiev. Now, this is what the New York Times said on January the 30th, 2014. No matter how incompetent, discredited, or unhealthy he may be, Mr. Yanukovych is the democratically elected president, and to oust him by street protests and without a coherent plan or united leadership would be a recipe for further turmoil and a dangerous precedent. That was the leader, that was the opinion of the New York Times. Now, I put it to you, ladies and gentlemen, in all honesty, if we turn this round, whether it was, violent protest by communists backed by Russia against a Western-backed regime in the former Soviet Union, or if something of this happened backed by a rival great power to an American-backed government in Central America, and this odious but democratically elected government was chased out in these circumstances, what would America have done? We have no excuse for not knowing this. We know what America would have done. We don't know exactly what it would have done, but based on all past experience, it would have had very much the very harsh response that I have suggested is, in fact, the international norm. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to turn to James now, but I did want to mention he's the co-author of this Chatham House publication, The Russian Challenge. And now you've got 5 minutes, maybe 6.
Okay. Well,
to be fair.
thank you very much indeed. I'd also like to add my thanks to Oza Anatol, to the amazing GCSP. I've never been in a think tank quite like this. My own institute back in London positively creaks by comparison. So I'm very grateful to you for showing me around, and thank you, Stephanie, wherever you are. I think what I'll do, if you don't mind, Madam Chairwoman, is I will spend 5 minutes on my pre-prepared remarks, like Anatol, but of course I'm itching to respond to Anatol, but as we've got another 5 minutes after that, I'll save those sort of asterisks on my page of notes, and I'll just go straight in. So anyway, look, Anatol started with a caveat about defending Russia, and he's quite right, of course. And I'll start with one as well, which is, but the West is no angel. Okay, let's be honest here. I mean, my own country sent smallpox-ridden blankets to the indigenous Americans. It invented the Gulag in the Boer War in South Africa. America has been engaged in all sorts of invidious foreign adventures from Cambodia to the Middle East. So, but let's face it, we are no angels. So I am not, in the same way that Anatol wasn't defending the West, was defending Russia in any way, then I am not defending the West. But it is germane to this debate to talk about Russia's crimes and misdemeanors. And I am going to list a lot of those, actually, in the past, shall we say, 15 years, the time that Putin has been on the throne, if you like, in Russia. Because on balance, if you had to assess it, I think we're better. I don't think we're great, but I think we're better. Now, it appeals, anyway. What shall I start with? Oh, I don't know. Shall we start with the prosecution of the war, 2 wars, actually, in Chechnya against its own people, with appalling human rights atrocities, the callous attitude to life exemplified by, after the sinking of the Kursk in 2000 and 2001, the arbitrary dismantling of a relatively clean oil company in the form of Yukos, and the arbitrary imprisonment of its CEO for a decade, the assassinations of high-profile journalists and politicians within Russia. I'm not saying necessarily that the Kremlin was responsible for all of them, but certainly it's responsible for the conditions that created those situations. The sponsorship of assassinations abroad. Litvinenko in my own city of London, an obvious example. The continual bullying of opposition, the lack of separation between the court and state, the clamped down upon opposition and the media, the oppression of NGOs, now classed as foreign agents if they take Western money, the continual bullying, and this is a major aspect of today's debate, of former Soviet neighbors who are not regarded as equal or sovereign, leading to the de facto annexation of approximately 20% of Georgian territory in 2008, cyber attacks on several countries, most notably Estonia, and of course the illegal annexation and by subterfuge, of Crimea, and the fighting of a war against the legitimate democratic Kiev government in Ukraine right now, which is not recognized as being a proper country at all by the Russians. And all of which actions led to the destruction of the MH17 flight over Ukraine, for which Russia bears considerable responsibility. And finally, of course, we have the Syrian crisis, which is all about the support of yet another of their dictator clients and the desire to put one over on America, the continual need to be seen as a distinguishable great power with a veto over major world events. So this is just but I think that if you really want to think about how Russia acts and believes on the world stage, you've got to think of something called the Dima-Yakovlev law, which was done in relation or done after something called the Magnitsky Act, which was a desire to keep out people from the United States who had been involved in the murder of a lawyer some 6 years ago. And in response, the Russians decided that they would prevent all American couples from adopting Russian children, which to me shows you the sort of the narcissism, the self-obsession, the pride of an unethical and highly unpleasant regime in the Kremlin today. Now, on the specific issue of Ukraine, then, and perhaps I do have time to answer a couple of Anatol's points here, then I find it very hard to accept the idea that Yanukovych was the democratically elected president of Ukraine, or the legitimate leader, I think it was in the New York Times that Anatol just mentioned. And that is because that Yanukovych had lost he had discredited himself in almost every sense I can think of. He was not a democrat. It was not a democratic country. Unless you think that democracy only means having won an election reasonably fairly and squarely, then yes. But the fact that he is responsible for the shooting of up to 70 people in the Maidan that day. You asked a question at the start, Janine. Did the West foment a revolution? We shouldn't even be asking this question. The answer is very simply, obviously, unless you're an avid RT devotee, is no. It's not even a proper question. It really isn't. The idea that the West was in any way responsible for fomenting color revolution, it might like to, but it's just too dangerous, and America doesn't get up to such things. And of course, in the past, so we're going to have this discussion. We'll go into this in a lot more detail. And the final point I want to make, because I'm probably close to my 5 or 6 minutes, I would imagine.
You've got another.
I've got another couple. Is the idea? I think, and this is perhaps good, because I'll end on this point really. Is the idea that the Russians see Ukraine as a vital national interest? I don't disagree. But the problem is what happens when that national interest impinges upon the national interests of other countries? So there's about 150 million odd people in Russia, but there's about 150 odd million people in the other formerly Soviet states around the periphery of Russia. Do they not have an equal say? Russia's security situation seems to be predicated on the insecurity and weakening of others. So that makes it so that's the illegitimacy of this. And that is very much true for Ukraine. Ukraine, for Russia, stands east of an east-west dividing line. But for the vast majority of Ukrainians, both in the Maidan and in the whole country, the Maidan, the revolution, was not led by a group of right sector, far-right nationalist people, but it was actually led by a group of, by the will of the majority who desperately wanted Ukraine to be a modern, Western, European country. And Russia prevented that by all means that it could. In this case, military means. It will do it in other means if it wants to. Co-option, bribery, corruption, energy cutoffs, whatever. But in this case, it was more direct because more extreme measures were needed because of the way it was going. I will leave it there, but I've got a few more points to make in terms of to Anatol afterwards, but I feel I've had my 5 or so.
I'll go to Anatol, but I just want to make one thing clear, because I think this will be picked up later on, and
Yeah.
I'm certainly going to go after it. Were you saying that America does not do democracy promotion? So
I think
Victoria
that is-
Nuland, who
yeah.
we will go back to
Yeah.
later, who was the former
Yeah.
State Department
Yeah.
official, who of course
Yeah.
was
So,
very
screw
influential
the-
working. We'll come back to that, but
Yeah.
is that what you meant?
America does not do regime change. It does not. It's quite clear. Change. America does not do regime change, but I simply don't understand.
Iraq,
What-
Chile.
No. There were,
Guatemala, Iran, Vietnam.
I'll go into
Okay.
this. Okay, yeah, but that is what I'm saying. I can explain it if you want, but I mean, but I will absolutely, for sure.
Let's come back to that
Yeah,
on your
okay.
second, but I
Yeah,
think that's
yeah,
a
I'll come
really
to it.
important
Okay,
point,
it's an important point.
especially in
Okay.
terms of the Ukraine, where
Yeah.
Victoria Newland, who was the associate head of the State Department working there, was
Yeah.
very involved with the National Endowment for Democracy, which of course had also worked in Serbia, helping to topple
Yeah.
Milosevic. Good thing or bad thing, whatever you choose.
Yeah.
But let's go to Anatol, and then we will come back. 5 minutes to give
Yes,
your
well, I mean, firstly,
Thank you, James.
forgive me, but I mean, that is just, I mean, American officials have boasted of the amount of money that America has given to the, gave over the years, to the opposition in Ukraine. They've boasted of that on the record, officially. I mean, and as for America's record, well, we, I mean, Panama, just to take some
But hang on a minute, in
recent
Panama,
examples.
if I may, so Kevin, seriously then, as I understand it, Carter gave up the Panama Canal to a left-wing nationalist leader, voluntarily, not under duress.
I would love to go down
Yeah,
this
sorry,
route,
okay, I'm
because
sorry.
personally, I would love to take America point by
Yeah,
point
yeah,
for
it's not
all
the-
it
it's not
has
the case,
done.
yeah, it's
But I
not-
think we've got to stick to the Ukraine and Russia, because we've got so much to go through.
Well, sorry, but I mean, just to answer
We
these
can come
points, first
Yeah.
of all, you cannot define whether a leader is or not democratic by the extent to which you dislike him. I'm sorry, but a democratically elected president is a democratically elected president, and Yanukovych's election was certified.
There are principles of democracy, Anatol.
No,
Beyond
sure,
the
Clearly cut to
Yeah,
principles of
But that's
democracy.
why, no, but that's why you vote him out at the next elections.
was
But that is an appalling. I need hardly
Was
point
that
out
a free and fair
that what
election?
Yes, it was. It was certified by European Union.
Oh, I agree with that. That I agree with, of course.
But that is, I mean, that is a truly dangerous precedent, because at that point, I mean, who deserves to be kicked out by street protests? Can be anybody you don't like, and what is sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. Russia and other countries can just turn that round. Now, as to the overwhelming majority of the Ukrainian people being against him, if you look at the pattern of Ukrainian elections since independence, they have been very evenly balanced over the years between what you could call broadly people who wish for good relations with Russia and the Russian alignment, and those who wish to move to the West. Now, there are nuances there. On the whole, there have been significant differences between strong majorities of Ukrainians not wanting, being against membership of NATO over the years. Every poll shows that. And somewhat
Not anymore.
smaller-
Not anymore.
well, yeah, but I have to say, I mean, remember what I said about what happened to the parties that supported Yanukovych after the overthrow of Yanukovych. I do not think that in other circumstances many Western observers would certify the political process that has occurred in Ukraine since the overthrow of Yanukovych as wholly free or fair. But as late as early 2014, according to Western-sponsored polls, including the International Republican Institute, other American institutes, European institutes, the vote, the figures, when it came to membership of the European Union, this, by the way, is membership of the European Union, not a very unclear association agreement, rather like with Turkey, that might conceivably lead to membership decades down the line, was between 38% and 47% of respondents. And those who favoured the Eurasian Union, promoted by Russia, was between 29% and 38%. Now, that is a majority for the European Union, certainly, but it shows a very large proportion of the population, as they had ever since independence, continuing to vote for a Russian alignment. Now, that has a great deal to do with the fact that, of course, a very large proportion of the Ukrainian population is ethnic Russian, 20% or so. Getting on for 40% speak Russian. Now, that's not a clear marker of course, political allegiance, but still. But also, Russia is still, even after everything that's happened, Ukraine's largest single trading partner. And also the Ukrainian industrial economy is overwhelmingly dependent on trade with Russia. And, of course, Russia has provided Ukraine over the years with massive amounts of subsidized gas. The Russian gas subsidy over the years exceeded European Union aid to Ukraine, often by a factor, an order of magnitude, 10 times over. So, it is completely illegitimate to declare now that the Ukrainian people as a whole have simply, let alone before March 2014, come down on one side. Now, as for what James said about the unpleasant character of the Russian regime, that may be true in a good many instances. It's also completely irrelevant for the question. Totally irrelevant. After all, with all its faults, Russia is still a great deal more democratic and freer than China. We do not treat China in the same way that we have sought to treat Russia. We don't do that because if we did treat China in that way, we would all be merrily playing around in World War III.
Further away.
No, it's not further away. We are more frightened of it. We treat it. But that has nothing to do with the character of the regime, any more than when it comes to dealing with dictatorships around the world. I now work in the Middle East. The notion that Russia is in some way extraordinary or different from the United States in backing a brutal dictator in the Middle East, oh, dearie me.
Saudi comes to mind.
Saudi comes to mind. Egypt comes to mind. Iran in the past comes to mind. And so on, and so on, and so on. As I say, may or may not be true, completely irrelevant. Finally, when it comes to the question of the shootings, which, as you well know, originally in the conversation between Miss Ashton and the Estonian foreign minister, more recently in various investigations, including at present, by the Ukrainian prosecutor's office, a great deal of evidence has come out suggesting, not for certain, but certainly raising very considerable doubts, whether these killings were not in fact initiated by provocateurs from the ultra-nationalist militias, which, as I say, in the end, were the ones who toppled Yanukovych.
Okay, I'm going to turn to James. And James, first
Yeah.
I'd like you to address Anatol's point.
Yeah.
Was your roll call of the human rights abuse and all that Russia does, which is wrong, is that irrelevant to our argument?
It's a lot more relevant than talking about China's. I didn't notice China in the title anywhere, or Saudi Arabia's. I wouldn't begin to doubt that we don't treat China fairly, or we don't treat it in comparison with Russia. The fact that we don't do the right thing everywhere doesn't mean to say we shouldn't do the right thing anywhere. So every country should be treated on its merits, and I'm sure, I'm not a China expert, but I am quite sure we are highly expedient. I started off by not defending the West, by saying how we are no angels, and I'm quite sure that we give China an easy ride. But I think we give Russia a fair ride based upon the misdemeanors and crimes that it commits. So that's my answer to your immediate question. Now I'm going to go back to the sort of a comparative question very briefly. Again, I said that all countries have national interests. The question is how they. This is the one thing Anatol didn't answer, by the way. The question is how they affect the interests of others. And I'd personally like to know from Anatol, what about Ukrainian national interests, Anatol? What about Moldovan national interests, Kazakh national interests? Are they less important than Russian national interests? To me, they are precisely the same. But on the question of this sort of, I mean, it's for me, I mean, I'm not a US expert, but I'm going to have to go here because it's been mentioned. But several generations have passed since the US claimed a privileged role in Latin America. Brazil is a member of BRICS, for example, but America doesn't really have a say on it. It doesn't really want to say on it. The US doesn't even draw a red line over the overtly anti-American relationship between Venezuela under Chavez and Russia. So I don't think that there is any kind of analogy here. Analogies between one historical context and another are eye-catching, but they are perilous, and all situations are ultimately sui generis. And I just can't understand the sort of a sense in comparing US policy during the Cold War to Russian policy sort of long after it. I mean, which people in Latin America were liquidated by the United States or deported en masse? Which institutions of governance or administration or security and economic management did the US impose and direct? What control mechanisms were created by the US which were analogous to those of the Communist Party and the KGB? I think there is no analogy here worth speaking about, just a collection of non sequiturs, really, emotive non sequiturs at that. Now, if I could just refer to my bad handwriting and the notes. The West should be seen to compromise. The West should seek compromise. I apologize. That is my handwriting. Again, I would ask Ansel, what does that mean? To me, that means that we will have to limit Ukraine's security. Unfortunately, Russia and the West are in the middle of an intractable dispute. It is irreconcilable. Not that we have to go to war, obviously. In fact, I think we should exercise strategic patience, in fact. But really, if one side believes that Ukraine should be east of an east-west dividing line, and the other side thinks that Ukraine should do what it democratically wishes to do, because okay, Anatol and I can go over history again, we can talk about the Maidan, we can talk about the majority, but actually I was a monitor in Ukraine's election, the last elections, the parliamentaries and the presidentials, and the vast majority of Ukrainians, whether you like it or not, Anatol, the vast majority of Ukrainians voted for Poroshenko, who articulated a explicitly pro-Western Euro-Atlantic agenda. Question. I don't understand what compromise means, though. Democratic, been through that. Can I leave it there?
Yeah.
I
want to ask you something.
Yeah, sure.
I'm going to come to you first.
Yeah.
Great powers are sensitive to threats near their home territory. So we've had 2 rounds of NATO expansion.
Yep.
We've deployed NATO and U.S. Special Forces operations near Russia's borders, irritated them by suggesting Georgia and the Ukraine, both important to Russia, as important as Kosovo was to Serbia, to join. The EU initiative Eastern Partnerships. This is all trying to persuade Ukraine to join. Isn't this provocative? I mean, this goes back also to the Clinton administration and their policy of expansion.
I think
so tell me, convince me that this is not provocative.
Okay. I'm surprised we haven't come to this yet. Neither Anatol and I have really mentioned NATO expansion, but it is part of the crux of the matter. I don't think it's the whole matter, by the way, but it's part of the crux of the matter. I'm sure Anatol and I would agree on that. But the Cold War's over, guys. I mean,
is it?
We're not.
Look at the Middle East today. Look at the alliances in the Middle East lining up in terms of the Syrian war. Is it really over?
To accept, I mean, again, analogies are dangerous. There are so many differences of ideology, people, politics between now and the years of the Cold War. But I think that any sort of, you're almost fueling the Kremlin argument by talking about a rehash of the Cold War. It puts Russia, which has an economy about the same size as Italy, by the way, it puts Russia on this superpower pedestal, which it no longer belongs on. I'm sorry about that, but it's simply the case. Now, let's talk about spheres of influence again. I can't emphasize enough that after 1991, there was a new post-Cold War order, something that Russia is now explicitly rejecting. But it had accepted that, actually, hitherto. Maybe not. Russia signed up to the Paris Charter and the Helsinki Final Act, and now it helped to write some of these agreements. And now it is, in fact, explicitly going against them. It wishes to rewrite that internationally accepted post-Cold War order. Now, NATO expansion specifically, if you're a citizen of Estonia, Lithuania, or Latvia, for example, I guarantee you the vast majority of those citizens are very, very grateful for their NATO membership because they believe it affords them a measure of security which they would not otherwise have. And I just don't understand the point about NATO expansion on the basis that we're no longer living in the Cold War. It is a Cold War mentality. Why should it be a problem if we're not dealing with great superpowers anymore? It simply doesn't make any sense.
I'm going to go to you with another question, and then this will all come back together. Anatol, I want to talk to you about revolutionary contagion. Outside of the lives of the rich oligarchs in Russia, Russia's in tatters. It's poverty-stricken. The prices of oil have dropped considerably. It's an aging population, diminished health care. It's a miserable life if you're not a rich oligarch. And yet... Okay, and yet Putin is spending his people's money on military forays into the Crimea and Ukraine. What is he hoping to achieve? What's he thinking? And is this anything to do with revolutionary contagion, the fear that revolution could spread, and he's got to suppress it? What's he thinking? What's going on in his head?
Well, look, I mean, first of all, Russia is not, Western Europe. But then again, I mean, if it's a question of spending money on, foreign adventures and the military, rather than, the needs of your own people. You visited the Midwest recently? Detroit? Indiana?
No, but let's not go back.
we're not
let's
talking
not
about
use
them.
America.
No,
let's
my
stick
point
to
is that
Russia.
a government, and any government in the world, is both entitled and obliged to defend what the state elites, if you like, define
But
as its
domestically,
security.
Russia is
Domestically, no, it's not. I mean, it is certainly. I mean, as I say, Russia is poorer than Western Europe, but the mass of the Russian people are not starving. The Russian popular birth rate has declined a great deal less than that of those in the Baltic states, for example.
But they're better off in the Baltic states, right?
Oh, of course they're better off in the Baltic states, but I mean, my point is that the population could be doing a great deal better, but I mean, this is not a state which is, facing terminal collapse. At least, I mean, certainly, if you look by the standards of, the upper ranks of the developing world. I mean, compare Russia to the other BRICS. It's not doing too
What's
badly.
he thinking?
But sorry,
What is Putin? What is he thinking? Is he defending his territory? Is he thinking expansion? Is he going back to imperial Russia? What is, in your view, of course, because we can't be inside his head, what is his strategy?
Well, first of all, I think it's very important to note that because I think this has been a grave mistake of the Western analysis and the Western media. This is not Putin, or it's not just, it is Putin, but it's not just Putin.
Sure.
This is the Russian establishment, the foreign policy establishment in general. It includes, by the way, leading Russian figures, both officials and intellectuals, who were in the past identified as strongly pro-Western. State liberals, if you like, something that has, considerable. The Russian establishment, and indeed the overwhelming majority of the Russian people, but I speak of the establishment because you can always argue that the Russian people have been propagandized and so forth, but the establishment has united in opposition to Western policy in Ukraine.
I agree.
And they've done so not, I would say, mainly because of this idea of contagion elsewhere, but because, for reasons which, are the stuff of innumerable books, and once again, we have no excuse for not understanding, Ukraine itself is the key and principal issue, both in terms of history, but also, of course, in terms of ethnicity, the number of Russians there. And because, to be perfectly honest, the Russian elites have seen not, of course, human rights abuses in the Baltic states, but the way that, contrary to promises made before Baltic independence to Russia and the West,
there were promises made that were reneged by the West
in terms
towards
of
Russia.
in terms of the Russian language, and so forth and so on. So this is, I mean, the Russian state believes that NATO and European Union membership for Ukraine are a severe threat to Russian security and economic interests. They believe that the language of the Cold War has, of course, been used repeatedly in the West by Western media, by Western experts, and especially, of course, by certain allies in Eastern Europe. This is by, this is...
Angela Merkel said that Putin was in another world, losing his hold on the country, regretting the demise of his country. Yeah. Is he that, or is he a first-class strategist?
No, he's not a first-class strategist, but he is in another world. He is in the world that I described. Angela Merkel, she doesn't even live in the world of France, if you look at French policy in Africa and so forth. Angela Merkel lives in this wonderful, safe European paradise from a security
Well,
point
she's
of
now
view.
been flooded by
Russia.
600,000 migrants, and she's
Yes.
done a bloody good job at that. So
Well,
I don't
she
think you
is
can
beginning-
say she lives in a bubble.
No, but I mean, in terms of direct security threats, Russia does...
We have terrorism threats in Europe. We have
Terrorism, certainly.
attacks.
But Russia, as I've said, Putin lives in the rest of the world, in which, as I say, well, the rest of the world lives, including most of the time the United States. Now, if I might just finish by referring to Central America, first, the United States most certainly has not given up its claim to a privileged position in Central America. Latin America, perhaps, but secondly, in terms of, it's not asserting this as violently, as ruthlessly as it did in the past, because it doesn't need to. There is now, unlike during the Cold War, where the Soviet Union was fishing in these waters, there is no outside great power ideological threat there. But if you look in the not very distant past at the kind of regimes that the US backed there and what they got up to, 200,000 dead in Guatemala, 200,000. In any other circumstances,
I'd like both
we
of
would
you
have
to
called that
stick to
genocide.
Ukraine and Russia, because
Yeah.
we can go through a roll call, and I'm going to cut you there to go to a
But with
question
all
to
due
James.
respect, we cannot do that. Because to argue in these terms means that in every case where it suits us, we can argue for our righteousness. And in every case where it doesn't suit us, we can say, oh, that's irrelevant. You see?
Okay, now, James,
Not-
this does pertain to this slightly. Did the Western states, particularly the U.S., under Victoria Nuland and others, the National Endowment for Democracy, stir the flames? Did they contribute funds that would promote future democracy? And is there actual evidence, and if so, can you give it to me, of a Western state providing assistance to Maidan? There's been a lot of stuff on YouTube and the internet, but is there actually any specific, and I'd like you to answer that and then to go back to you, and then I have one more question, and then I'm going to turn it over to all of you because I want to give you enough time to also have your own questions answered.
Yes, sorry, what was the first question again? The very first one?
Did the Western states, particularly the U.S. under Victoria Nuland and others, stir the flames by contributing funds that would promote future democracy?
Okay.
The National Endowment for Democracy.
Okay, I understand.
And evidence of the Western states.
Anis also mentioned this, and I forgot to reply to it in the beginning of in his first presentation. And of course, the West has provided democracy assistance funds to Ukrainian institutions. It's funded NGOs. It does fund democracy promotion NGOs in Ukraine. That is not the same thing as fomenting revolution in Ukraine. Is there evidence that the American special forces, espionage agents were in the Maidan Square during the revolution? None whatsoever. There is, however, you talked about YouTube videos, there is plenty of evidence of Yanukovych snipers dressing, undressing into their kit, getting ready, going there. I can't, this was far more fomented by the Russians. Now, you asked what happened. What happened was that that Ukraine was signing an association agreement with the EU. There were 2 years of very technical, very detailed negotiations between Ukraine and the EU. It was all going according to plan. Why we were doing this with somebody like Yanukovych, I do not know, and I would not defend that. But we were. We were all on course to sign an association agreement. Yanukovych goes to Sochi. Putin shoves him up against a wall, says you will not be signing this agreement, or else. And Yanukovych U-turned at the last minute. The U-turn caused the popular revolution.
There was a counter offer which was much higher, wasn't it, and much more suited to
Absolutely.
Ukrainians.
Putin bought them out. There was co-option. But that was not according to a popular will. Yanukovych fell from power because he didn't recognize what his people wanted. Because he succumbed to Putin's bullying tactics, his threats. Russia's a bully. Putin bullies his fellow leaders, but he also bullies its neighboring countries as well. It's quite, and the historical record and the facts show this quite clearly. There is no, I can't. This is propaganda of the highest order, straight from Russia Today, to believe that somehow the West is interfering in Ukrainian affairs for its own designs. I accept the fact that there are American officials who want this person or that person in Ukraine. They don't control things. The people of Ukraine are controlling things, and they controlled things through democratically held elections last year, plain and simple.
So is he in another world, as Merkel said, or is he a first-class strategist?
I agree with Yanis. He's not a first-class strategist by any means, because it's extraordinary what support is lost. I mean, what kind of first-class strategist pretty much loses all the friends he has, all the allies he has, except for Assad of Syria and a few other crazy regimes in the Asian East. I can't. Putin is an opportunist tactician, as we've seen over Syria.
Regretting the demise of his country?
I think very much trying to make his country what it was. Putin is what he was, KGB colonel, and he wants to make Russia once what it was. He said himself, and I'm sorry to bring out this cliche because it is a little boring, but he said himself that the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century, you've all heard this, was the destruction of the Soviet Union.
No, he didn't. He didn't.
Yes, he did.
No, he didn't. He said that the greatest geopolitical catastrophe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now
A
that's,
difference which makes no difference.
No.
Okay.
You will find a great many people in the Middle East saying that, including people from pro-American regimes who are at the same time very unhappy that there is only America as an outside player to help and depend on. Putin did not say that the collapse was a tragedy per se. No Russian would say that. They would refer to the Second World War as the greatest tragedy. He said it was a tragedy in geopolitical terms, something which, as I say, many people around the world would agree with.
Both of you, just one final question, and then we're going to go to you. Is there a chance in a solution, can there be a neutral Ukraine that might get economic reforms or money from the West, but is allowed to be a buffer between Russia and NATO? Something like Austria was during the Cold War days. Is this a possibility? Is this something that could?
Yeah. Well, look, firstly, I was reading a Reuters piece recently from the autumn of 2014, which described the audible sighs of relief in Brussels, in the corridors of the EU, in the autumn of 2013, when Yanukovych accepted the Russian offer and not the European Union offer, because, of course, these European leaders and officials did not want and do not want Ukraine in the European Union, because they know the enormous cost, and they are above all deeply afraid of free labour movement. So let us not. There is this wonderful idea that has been propagated that we are offering Ukraine membership of the European Union. We're not.
No, we're not.
Not in any foreseeable future.
No.
But if you read the polls, once again in Ukraine, Ukrainians in these opinion polls do not say that they want an indefinite accession process. They want the benefits of membership now. They're not going to get it.
That's true.
Now, the thing is, the compromise, however, is, look, firstly, on the most important issue, as far as Russia is concerned, people have totally forgotten that. Russia has lost. The point was to get Ukraine into the Eurasian Union, because without Ukraine, the Eurasian Union is hopeless. And the whole idea was to create a bloc that would have some chance of competing to some degree on the world stage with the European Union, with America, with China. That's gone. It's gone forever. You can't bring Ukraine into anything like that. We don't want Ukraine in the European Union. As for the idea of Ukrainian NATO membership, we have now proved again and again and again that under no circumstances will we fight to defend Ukraine. Now, in those circumstances, to suggest an offer of an Article 5 guarantee to defend Ukraine, which we have proved and we know we have no intention of honouring, that is not just grossly irresponsible, that is deeply unethical in international terms. So the point is to give Ukraine space in which it can pursue reforms, to have an internal constitution in Ukraine which provides sufficient protection for the regions of Ukraine, and now obviously has to involve enhanced autonomy for the Donbass, unless we're going to have a war to reconquer it by force. And yes, which puts Ukraine in a neutral position, which, as you've said, Janine, Austria occupied with perfect happiness for several decades, a position of neutrality which was strictly respected by both sides, by the USSR and by the West.
James, do you want to go
I can
to...
do 1 minute. Can I do 1 minute?
1 minute,
Or not
then
even
we're
that.
gonna go
Not
to-
even a minute.
Okay.
But can Ukraine be neutral? I don't care whether Ukraine goes into the Eurasian Union, the European Union, or is neutral. It is not up to me, Anatole, Janine, anybody in this room, unless you happen to be Ukrainian in this room, in which case it is extremely important. It is what Ukrainians want which is important. Now, with membership of NATO, obviously it has to be, and I'm not advocating Ukrainian membership of NATO, by the way. Ukraine's not ready. You have to be interoperable. You have to be compatible, and it's not ready yet. Clearly, Ukraine is beset by the most terrible corruption. It's got worse problems from within. I'm sure Anatole would probably agree almost, than it has externally.
Yeah.
And so, for a number of reasons, Ukraine isn't ready for NATO, for EU membership or NATO membership. But if it were to be ready, and if it did want it, by a majority of the people, then who are we to say otherwise? Who is Russia to say otherwise? Least of all, Russia is no different to the Netherlands, the UK, America. Ukraine is an independent, sovereign, autonomous country. I can't be clearer about that, unless, of course, you're in the Kremlin, in which case it's an illegitimate accident of history, and that's outrageous.
Good point about national interest. Okay, let's go to the audience. I think we've got a microphone somewhere that we could, please. And we've got a good half hour for questions, and then we'll vote again. We'll have a summing up, and then we'll vote.
Good evening, Paul Vallée. Thank you very much for the first very stimulating debate. One question is, where do you see the problem in treating in this motion the notion of the West as a unified bloc when it's multiple, when we're talking about several entities, organizations, all of which have nearly 30 member states each, who are all yelling at each other tonight in Brussels. So how does that those fragmented entities, how could they do provocation? Thanks.
Okay, Anatole, then James, you want to take that?
Well, yes, indeed. In the immortally recorded words of Victoria Newland, do what to the European Union? I probably shouldn't say it on camera, but you will no doubt remember. No, you're absolutely right, of course. A fragmented West, as we see today. I mean, very significant differences between Germany and France and Washington on this score. Nonetheless, NATO membership was pushed by, well, it was, of course, delayed by France and Germany, but it was certainly assiduously pushed by the United States and Britain, and the US is, of course, the dominant power in NATO. And the European Union, I mean, albeit very much driven by Sweden and Poland, but it did come up with the United Eastern Partnership. But, by the way, I do have to say, if Yanukovych was, in fact, such a repulsive and undemocratic leader, why did we relax our own standards so far?
I agree.
Well, no, but seen from Moscow, there is only one answer to that, because we were determined, the European Union was determined, or at least countries driving it, to block the Eurasian Union agreement. And this is not my analysis. You can read that, you know, in standard Western sources like Reuters. Again, in other words, this was a geopolitical move aimed against Russia, not what the European Union has generally got up to.
James?
So is a unified is treating as a unified bloc a problem? Yes, of course it is. I mean, 28 countries. I mean, crikey. I mean, I don't suppose. Of course, there is a sort of a north-south divide. The countries of Scandinavia, Britain, Netherlands favour a more robust response towards Russia than the Mediterranean countries. Eastern Europe, of course, for historical reasons, by and large favours. Germany, of course, it's extraordinary, again, how Putin's, again, not being a strategist, Putin has managed to turn Germany. Germany was Russia's greatest ally in Europe. And Merkel, who I believe has shown moral leadership in this crisis,
I agree.
has managed to drag a reluctant German industrialist lobby around with her on the basis that national security is more important than corporate interest. And even the head of the German Union of Industrialists said recently that if we just pursue the money in Russia, which is what we've been doing, there will be no money. And we've got to look at this in the longer term. But yeah, of course it's not a unified bloc. How can any group of 28 countries, 30 countries, whatever you like, ever be unified? That said, extraordinarily and perhaps contrary to Putin's expectations, these group of countries, the EU and the US, have commonly agreed on sanctions. They must all believe, that Russia deserves some form of admonishment, punishment, retribution. We can go into sanctions if you like, on the basis of what it did in Ukraine, the illegal annexation of part of another independent country, and because of its role in MH17. As a result of which, because otherwise, if there is no reaction, what is the point? What are we all doing here? What's the point of foreign policy at all? So actually sanctions, which should not be the whole response to Russia, that would be pathetic. There needs to be a Russia strategy. There needs to be a more clearly thought out, if you do X, we'll do Y strategy, which we don't have, quite frankly. We make up policy on the hoof. But Putin, of course, has the luxury, unlike the West hasn't gone into Syria because the House of Commons and Congress voted against it. Putin's got a rubber-stamping Duma, so therefore he can go into Syria with great ease. That's why Putin doesn't have the democratic constraints, the value constraints that we all operate under.
Okay, next question.
Thank you very much. My name is Maria Hedinska. I'm from the Russian mission. First of all, I would like to thank you all for this very, very interesting debate, really. 2 points, if I may. Well, it's about Russia, so I will use 1 minute at least. I would like to agree with you, James, that the Cold War is over and the Cold War mentality should be over. So dismantle NATO. NATO is a Cold War relic. It was actually designated against the Soviet Union, which was fine at that time because we lived in a certain epoch. But now, I mean, if the Cold War is over, why do we keep NATO? Why do we expand NATO? And just to remind you that the 2 waves of NATO expansion happened long before the Ukrainian crisis. So how do you explain that? This is a threat to our security. I'm sorry to say that, but it's a threat to our home security. Just imagine what the reaction of the US would have been if there would have been a Russian bloc or supported by Russia at the US borders. And the second comment or even question, James said that Maidan was actually a democratic revolution carried out by beautiful people, women with flowers, youth, students, whatever. Maybe, I don't argue that. I haven't been in Maidan at the time. But then Russia, reacted like a bear, aggressed Ukraine, sent weapons, mercenaries, troops, whatever. Now, the United Nations High Commission on Refugees stated that 1,100,000 of Ukrainian people escaped to Russia. So if you are aggressed by a bear, why are you escaping to this country that actually tried to kill you? I mean, this is my question. Why don't you just go to Kharkov, which is very close, or to Kiev, or to Odessa, or to any other region? Why do you run away from Russia to Russia? This is my question.
Refugees are desperate people, though. Often
Yeah, but you can run to other regions of Ukraine. Kharkov is very close, Mariupol, whatever, Kiev.
Okay.
I mean, if you run away from Russia, why do you run away from Russia to Russia? This is my question. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll go Anatole first and James, and do you want to take this?
I mean, on NATO expansion, yes. And indeed, as...
Dismantle NATO?
Well, no, but I mean, Sir Roderick Braithwaite, amongst others, Jack Matlock, have said that a verbal promise was given to Gorbachev not to expand NATO, at the time of German unification, and we clearly broke that. And it is no good telling Russia that this is not directed against Russia, given the language, the rhetoric about it, which came continuously, not just from Eastern Europe, but from supporters of expansion, to some extent in Western Europe, but even more strongly in the United States. So that, yes. And on where the refugees go, well, of course, one of the reasons for that is simply that Russia has so much higher living standards than Ukraine. And, of course, since what happened in 2014, you said that, the Russian economy is in tatters. I said it wasn't. What there is no denying is that the Ukrainian economy is in tatters. And one reason for that is what I said, that in the whole run-up to this process, the West tended completely to ignore the degree to which the Ukrainian and Russian economies were still intertwined, and the appalling damage to Ukraine that we were risking by trying to tear this economic relationship apart in short order. Finally, I mean, I think, what is also indirectly raised by this is the profound unwisdom in these circumstances of using phrases like the Ukrainian people this and, the Ukraine that. Because, I mean, surely we have learned from so many cases that if you have, say, a 50% plurality on one side and a 30%, opposition over a key and existential issue of national direction, it is crazy folly, utterly irresponsible, to say, oh, the majority has decided, it's all over. We should have learned that from Northern Ireland, from Bosnia, from so many other cases. In these circumstances, what you have to seek is compromise. Majoritarian democracy is a road to civil war, which is what we've got.
We have a civil. James,
Yeah,
NATO
got it.
expansion, dismantle NATO, Cold War relic?
Yep, it's of a lady from the Russian embassy. Can I just ask you, do you honestly believe NATO is going to attack Russia? Is it, really? I cannot understand how you can see, except by being brainwashed through propaganda, that NATO could ever have any intention of attacking Russia. NATO is not an existential threat to Russia. But if you are in Ukraine or Georgia, Moldova, Belarus perhaps, it's not beyond the realms of imagination that Russia is an existential threat to your country.
Yeah, I do have an answer. As Bismarck said, it's not when we talk about war potentials, it's not about weapons, it's about the potentials. So yes, it could be very dangerous to our interests. It's not about attacking, but it's about putting anti-air missile system. It's about putting your troops, etc.
Why is it dangerous to your interests? Why? I'm sorry, but if you don't mind, why? Because
if we put a Russian army in Canada at the border of the US, the reaction would have been the same.
But it's not. That's a hypothetical question.
Could we go to this gentleman here? Would you like to say something?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
We need to hear you, sorry.
Of course, NATO has not intention to attack Russia, but NATO technically was created against the danger was Soviet Union. And technically, today, for which reason NATO has with high weapons, with the tanks, with a lot of troops, etc., for the terrorism of you coming from Daesh, or for what? What? Of course, it's not a treat, but for which reason NATO is made? Technically, NATO is made against a big country. What is a big country today threat Europe?
So you see it as a Cold War relic as well?
NATO is made to be aware during the condition of Cold War. As soon as the Cold War
But it's
is
evolved,
finished,
it's adapted,
what is a
the
treat?
world has changed.
It has
You know
rebranded.
technically, NATO, what is NATO? What is NATO for what? For ISIS? For who?
Well, what I would say is that the Russians have done an extraordinarily...
NATO is just to maintain, a certain coordination between the country under the leadership of US. That's only for that today. It's not against the threat.
James, and then
I do think that Russia has done an extraordinary job of reviving NATO's flagging fortunes. That is extraordinary. That was not true. I would not have said that 5 years ago. But again, I come back to the point that if you live in Estonia, Lithuania, or Latvia, then you are very grateful for NATO's protection.
Finland?
Finland is debating it right now, as is
very
Sweden.
worrying. There's a question over here.
Yes, Eric Vakoyan. I worked for institutes in the 90s, geopolitical research institute I was working on the field of ex-USSR, so that drove me to try to understand the vision of the world from a Moscow point of view. I think to give a little historical perspective to really understand how Russians feel about this issue, you must know that Kiev was the cradle of Russia. The first Rus was in Kiev, and it all started there, and that the Ukrainian people as such only distinguished itself. the Ukrainian language separated from Russian only a century ago. It was just a Russian dialect. This is, I mean, these are roots we must really consider, and I think Americans used to have very problems to put historical and cultural perspectives to such problems. And also remind you that Crimea was a symbolical gift of Khrushchev in the 1950s. It has, for which Russia fought for many years and lost thousands of citizens to have at the time. And to get to the theme of tonight, for me, the fundamental provocation, I mean, is this NATO problem? I remind you that after the wall fell in Berlin, NATO immediately reassured Moscow we will not go further than the RDA. And what happened since then? So I think Russians have been really patient, and we must understand that they want to keep a sphere of influence, as they say, and especially in Ukraine, because it's deeply a part of the Russian collective soul.
Thank you for giving us that insight, because we're getting close to voting again. But we have a question here. And then, of course, we've got these. Let's take these three questions together. They will answer. Then we'll sum up. We'll do summary, and then we'll vote. So one, there was another, two, and then three. Okay. And someone else over there.
Well, I had a chance to live in Russia recently for 3 years, and taking place at a debate like this, also in Moscow. And I was quite impressed, and I couldn't believe my ears, that somebody was saying, if we wouldn't have nuclear arms, we would now be at war to the West. For me, it's more a question of perception. And I think we can debate whether the West has provoked or has not provoked, but Russians feel provoked. The perception is there. And my question mainly to you is, why has the West, why haven't we tried another policy? Why don't we try to speak with Russia? Because what has happened was entirely predictable. It's quite clear. Only we do not listen. The problem is, they say, if you do this, we'll do that. And we will say, no, they won't do that because they are shooting in their foot. And they are doing it.
Thank you. Okay, we'll get to your question.
Hi, thank you. This has been a wonderful debate. My name's Brandon. I'm with the U.S. mission here. There you go. So, I mean, I just want to say first off that there's points on both sides that I agree and disagree with. I do believe that Russia deserves the role, or deserves to be recognized as a superpower and a major player in the region. They've proven that they are. For Mr. Forgive me if Mr. Anatol, it's easier to pronounce it that way. A lot of times when I'm listening to your talk, you actually proved why I believe that the United States, or not the United States, but the West, did not provoke. Because we're talking about Russia playing in their own sphere of influence. They get to do what they want. They're not beholden to the rules of the EU. And if they have a proven track record, as James is talking about, of expansionism and whatnot, then they're just following suit with what they've always done. Whether or not NATO provoked that, presence of NATO, or the presence of actually going in with NATO would have provoked that, I don't know. I think James is right in the fact that it's now Russia's actions into Ukraine have justified NATO's existence. At the same time, Anatol, what use has it really? When we look at Georgia, they actually haven't. NATO has not proven itself to be a benefit in that regard. I want to go back though to this issue of provocation, though. In my opinion, for provocation to occur, there had to have been a threat against interest, right? So we're talking about what was the Western threat to Russian interest in Ukraine. That's my question. Maybe it's a simpleton perspective, but that's my
May I ask
major
you what
question.
you would, how you would answer that before we turn to James for that answer? How?
Honestly, I don't know.
Okay.
I wish.
Okay.
That's why I'm
We'll,
here
we'll
tonight.
let James take that one.
Okay.
And then there was a third question. Yes. Okay, James, you've got that.
Yeah, got that.
Let's get this one, then we'll go back to it.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Katrin Kosamari from the Mission of Latvia, and I would like to address three things. First of all, if we talk about Geneva and histories, and we are mainly addressing here the issue of the post-war world order. And if we go back to histories, and very many territories in the world belong to other countries. So this is not an argument. We are talking about very serious breach of post-war world order. And another issue is about provocations. So in the Baltics, we experience a huge amount of provocations from Russian military aviation intruding into our airspace, and also threatening civil aviation in the whole Nordic and Baltic region, not only in the Baltic states, but threatening civil aviation also in Sweden and Denmark. And a third issue that I wanted to mention just fell out of my mind. Well, I would like to address Anatol and ask if you could explain more into detail and with references who exactly in the West promised anything to the populations in the Baltic states, any specific things, if you could be more specific in your quotes. And the last thing is that I noticed when you quote statistics, you only quote how many percent support this or that. But there is always also the division, the part of undecided. So you should quote the full picture in order for us to understand how big a proportion of population exactly supports what side. Thank you.
Okay. So, James, let's first go to what was the threat? Let's answer
where are we?
And then Anatol, and then we must have closing arguments because we've got to vote. So
Yeah.
what was the threat? Was there a threat? I mean, for
threat from-
provocation, there has to be some sort of a
From
threat.
whom? Sorry.
The question from the...
What was the threat?
Ah.
What was the Western threat to Russian interests? That would justify the
My view on this, for what it's worth, is that Russia is threatened by a successful Ukraine. Ukraine is not successful, of course. Anatol and I both agree on that. But it could have been. It has the potential. I mean, when you go to Ukraine, it is a Western-leaning, Western-feeling, go-ahead, get-go country. And I think that threatens Russia's style of management very much so. In addition, again, Russia as the... I don't have a problem with Russia as a superpower, by the way. But Russia as the lead power, the key power in the former Soviet Union, you can't be a superpower if you're losing control of the smaller powers around you. You feel emasculated. So Russia must retain control of its children, of the countries which were once under the suzerainty of the Kremlin, in order to achieve its status as a superpower. So Russia needs to have that dominance, that escalation dominance, in order to retain its superpowerness. So it's based upon... So yes, I agree with Russia as a superpower, but it's based upon that dominance. Now, to take a couple of the other questions, if I may. Have I got time?
Quickly, because Anatol's going to answer the other, and then we really need to sum up.
Somebody said, haven't we tried another policy? I think it might have been your question, sir. So haven't we tried talking to Russia? My God, yes. In the whole of the 1990s, we tried to bring Russia into Western clubs rather than having them outside. That was a Bill Clinton doctrine. But even last year, Angela Merkel phoned Vladimir Putin 50 times. This year, she's phoned him about 30, 25 times. So we have tried very hard in talking to Russia, and it hasn't worked, which is why we're at the state that we're at now. I think I've answered the
Okay.
questions. Oh, there was trying to answer the gentleman. Yeah, but sorry, the gentleman next to you. Can I just answer the gentleman's point over there? You said about being sensitive to Russia's interests, and you'd lived in Russia for a long time. Sorry, just before you start.
Okay.
Can I
Quickly,
just
and
answer
then
his
let-
point,
okay.
which is that I understand that we must be sensitive to Russia's interests. You've lived and we understand about Kiev and Rus and tied ethnicities and the history of it. But again, the fact of the matter is, and again, still Anatol hasn't answered this point, but I hope he will in his closing
If you're
remarks.
summing up,
Of what happens when Russia's interests come into conflict with Ukraine's or Latvia's or Georgia's. Then we have an impasse. That's where we're at now. Sorry.
So national interests again. I'm going to just take your question, and then we're going to have to do summing up and close.
I think you always analyze from a Western perspective.
Yeah, I'm a Westerner.
Yeah, exactly. And you don't understand why transparency and democracy is not seen the same way on the other side. The fact is, for example, for Ukraine, Odessa was the main entrance of all the Iran in the war for the whole Europe. Now it's moving to Sevastopol in Crimea because and one of the first things they did when they took control of Crimea, the new prime minister of Crimea, Sergei Aksimov, is famous. He was known as a Goblin, is a famous monsters from a very long time. And I think we forget to analyze Russia with all that part of all this underworld. It's really important, I think, if we want to understand what's really behind, and this part is always forgotten. And I think it's the main point why we don't understand Russia, and we don't understand what's happening there and what's have their motivations.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to start with the summing up with Anatol, and maybe you can bring into the points from the Baltic states, or so you've got 2 minutes. because I'm sorry, but
I'll do my best.
be strategic.
Look, ringing up people and lecturing them, I'm a professor myself now, is not the same as talking with them or listening to what they say. You remember the American language of the 1990s by Victoria Newland, amongst others, Stroke Talbot, Baker, admirably bipartisan, eat up your spinach, do the right thing, etc., etc. But when he was president, but once again with the support of the Russian security establishment, Medvedev suggested a European Security Council, including Russia, European Union, NATO, in which you could talk on a more equal basis about future threats, try to head off future problems. There was no response from the West whatsoever. Well, there was a negative one, exactly. There was a negative one, in part because it was vetoed by Washington, so even the Europeans who wanted it. So please, you cannot convince the Russians that there was any sincerity there on our side. The nature of the threat, not of course a threat of direct attack, but it is now well known, was certified very soon afterwards by OSCE observers, there were leaks from NATO intelligence, that it was in fact Saakashvili and Georgia which attacked in August 2008, clearly on the assumption that America would come to their aid. It's not that NATO itself is going to go mad and attack Russia, but that it will give cover to other people with potential conflicts, rivalries with Russia, who will do things. Now, outside the military sphere, of course, that extends to the wider area of economics and the minority rights of the Russians outside Russia. Now, when it comes to Latvia and Estonia, I didn't say that the West had given these promises directly. I said that the Latvian and Estonian governments had given these promises, and I heard them because I was there as correspondent for the Times in the first half of 1991, had given them to the West and had given them to the Russian government under Yeltsin, that there would be full protection for the civic rights of all Russians, and there would be full official status for the Russian language in Latvia and Estonia. What happened thereafter? The West did, to some extent, come to the defense of the Russian minorities, otherwise, to head off what would otherwise have been a much, much worse crisis. But for example, Sweden was instrumental in this. The OSCE reporting mission tore up the European Council criterion for minority language education as far as Latvia and Estonia were
And so
concerned.
you're going to try to sum up your whole
but hang on.
argument.
You asked for a detailed answer, so that these countries could get into the European Union. Well, clearly, what any government in Moscow has to be afraid of, that you will have a future ultra-nationalist government in Ukraine, which will start doing these things, as far as the Russian minorities are concerned, under the shelter of a NATO security guarantee. That is the kind of threat. And I have to say, the fact that now the Ukrainian government is finally having to crack down on these people because they have become a threat to it, but that for more than a year, these ultra-nationalist, one could even say neo-fascist, I think in some cases, groups in Ukraine, Svoboda, right sector, have been intimidating, in some cases murdering their opponents, in the name of a pathologically anti-Russian and, by the way, anti-Semitic ideology. And the response from Western governments, in public at least, has been practically zero. One does have to understand, where the concerns of many Russians within Ukraine, but from Moscow also come from. So, finally, Russia in the former Soviet Union. Well, Ukraine is not going to be a successful. I mean, Ukraine's GDP per capita is less than a third of that of Russia. There are 3 million or more Ukrainians, migrant workers, let alone all the ones who intermarried in the Soviet days, working in Russia because of the Russian economy. And that's true of Armenia, it's true of Azerbaijan, it's true of Central Asia. Russia plays the role within the former Soviet Union, I'm simply now talking about economics and labor movement, very much like that of America in Central America. So Russia still, even after what's happened in Ukraine, remains the economic powerhouse. And various people, including Romano Prodi, on that basis argued very strongly in the autumn of 2013 that instead of positing EU partnership against Eurasian Union membership in the autumn of 2013, that we should have sought some kind of compromise, which, by the way, by December, how far Russia would have compromised, I don't know, but the Russian government was actually arguing strongly for that.
We've got to move to James now. Did the West provoke Russia? 2 minutes.
I will get to that, I promise, and I will do this in less than 2 minutes, I also promise. But the threat of an ultra-nationalist government coming to Ukraine, there is not an ultra-nationalist government coming to Ukraine. In the last 2 elections have been democratically free and fair. That is, and yet the Kremlin is not getting on with this democratically elected government. If it were a Pravi Sektor-led government or a Svoboda-led government, I would understand, but it is not. It is not coming to power. I fully agree, as we have said, that Ukraine is an economic basket case. But that does not make it any less legitimate as a country. So is Greece. I apologize if there are any Greeks in the audience, I really do. But being economically illiterate and economically crippled does not make you less legitimate as a power. So, to sum up, probably 1 minute, recognizing these states as fully sovereign is an anathema to Russia. An independent Ukraine has no meaning when that country's existence is regarded as an accident of history, as some people seem to have alluded to tonight. Look, it depends on whether you're a realist or not. If you are a realist, if you believe that big states have always lorded it over small states, and that's the way it's been since Thucydides, fine, vote for Anatole. But if you do believe that, again, I can't emphasize enough that Anatole has not answered this one question tonight, which is what about the sensitivities and the interests of Ukraine or Moldova or Kazakhstan? Because those...
Kazakhstan is an enthusiastic member of the Eurasian Union.
Okay,
no, it's not. No, it's not.
Okay, wait.
It is a highly unenthusiastic member.
Stick to your closing arguments.
I'm done. I'm done.
Okay,
Let me help
so
you
now
out.
we're going to vote. Green, did the West provoke Russia? Those who believe yes, raise the green card. That's a yellow card. Okay, can someone
1, 2,
count
3,
other
4,
than
5,
me?
1, 2, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. I'm counting 19.
Oh,
I'm counting
a late
21.
one.
21?
Okay.
21.
Yellow. No, the West did not provoke Russia. A few non-voters here.
It's even, isn't it, again?
Nope,
Can I vote?
I win.
Yeah. What is it? What was it?
Well, I'm allowed to vote, no?
It's casting vote. I think we haven't managed to change anybody's mind. Let's put it that way.
Thank you so much for coming. It's been a really lively debate. I want to thank Anatole and James. And we hope you'll come back. This is the first of a series. Our next one will be on Syria, hopefully in December. We'll then have many, many more. So please come back, and thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you so much. Thank you for my work.